Did you know that the tragedy in David's family goes far beyond what you learned in Sunday school? King David, one of the most remarkable men in the Bible, faced a devastating loss that changed his life forever. The death of his children was not only a personal tragedy, but also a reflection of a mistake we can all make. Today, we will look closely at this story, discover the secrets that few dare reveal, and understand how even great men of faith face pain. Get ready to see a part of history that may touch you in an unexpected way. Let's learn together how to deal with our own losses, mistakes, and difficult choices with lessons that can change the way we face life's tragedies. David's story cannot be told without mentioning the pain and suffering he experienced. Imagine the weight of being a man of war, a king chosen by God, but also a father. David was not a distant or cold king. He was someone deeply human, with emotions, flaws, and dilemmas that made his story unique. And it was this humanity, full of contradictions and complexity, that made his life marked by victories, but also by immense tragedies. At the beginning of his story, David was that young shepherd who, without knowing it, carried a great destiny. The boy who challenged Goliath with just a stone and unshakable faith. He was a man after God's own heart, but like any human being, he also failed. And these failures ended up shaping his reign, his life, and his relationships. Throughout his life, he experienced the pain of loss, the anguish of betrayal, and most of all, the grief of losing those he loved most, his own children. The starting point of this tragedy is the relationship between David and his son Absalom. Absalom, the third son of David, was born to Maacah, the daughter of the king of Geshur. From an early age, Absalom stood out for his beauty. He was a handsome man with long, silky hair, and his character did not go unnoticed. But his life of privilege and honor hid a soul full of resentment, mainly because of a tragedy that occurred years before: the death of his sister Tamar. Tamar was David's daughter by another wife, and Amnon, Absalom's brother, committed a terrible crime against her. He raped her. David, as a father and king, should have taken firm action against Amnon, but for some reason he did not. Absalom, driven by revenge and pain, killed Amnon at a banquet, and this action would become the trigger for the family crisis that followed. David, although deeply hurt, had to deal with the loss of two sons, but the situation became even more difficult over time, as his relationship with Absalom would never be the same again. After Amnon's death, Absalom went into exile. For 3 long years he was outside Jerusalem, away from his father. David, feeling guilty for not having acted as he should, wished the situation were different, but time only deepened the gulf between them. Absalom, in turn, was not just waiting to return. He was plotting, watching, planning. He knew he had one burning desire: his father's throne. He started winning hearts. Absalom had the ability to attract people with his beauty and persuasiveness. He made himself available to anyone who needed help, showing a face of kindness that did not match his true intentions. Little by little, he won the support of the tribes of Israel, spreading rumors about David's inability to govern and suggesting that he could be a stronger, more just leader. His strategy was sneaky but effective. He knew that to overthrow his father, he would need the people's trust. And so it was that over time, Absalom's exile turned into an open conspiracy. He called the tribes of Israel to a meeting, and there in the middle of the way, Absalom declared himself king. He raised the banner of rebellion against his own father, who was now seen as weak and aged. Absalom, with an army made up of his followers and traitors, marched towards Jerusalem, ready to take David's throne. David, upon receiving news of his son's rebellion, was devastated. Imagine what it's like to be a father and see one of your children come against you like that. The pain he felt was not just from the betrayal, but from the fact that he knew his son He knew that Absalom was doing this because of the lack of correction, the failure to treat situations within his own home fairly. The weight of David's guilt was overwhelming, and the situation became increasingly distressing. He, who had been a man of courage before Goliath, was now facing a different battle, an internal battle that not even his weapons could solve. He knew he would face his own blood, his own son. David's decision was made quickly. He could not fight Absalom in the city of Jerusalem, where his family was vulnerable, so he decided to run away. He left the city with his most loyal followers, seeking refuge in the mountains. By doing so, he was not only fleeing the conflict, but also protecting the lives of his family. It was an escape, but also an attempt to save what was left of his lineage. He didn't know what the future would hold for him, but he knew he would have to fight not only against Absalom, but against everything that his own life and choices had generated. He, a king, found himself once again as the simple shepherd fleeing from his enemies, but now with a much greater weight on his shoulders. What no one knew, not even Absalom, was that this rebellion would begin to pave the way for a personal and family tragedy of immeasurable dimensions. What David could not predict was that the battle for his life and his throne would also become a fight for his own son's heart. And this fight would be marked by choices, mistakes, and losses that no one could imagine. David never imagined that he would be forced to experience the pain of losing the throne of Israel to one of his own sons. He was always a man of courage, willing to face giants with a simple stone. But this time, he was not fighting against external enemies, but against his own flesh and blood. The truth is that the confrontation with Absalom was not just a political or military battle. It was an internal war, a war of heart and soul. Love and hate intertwined in unimaginable ways. However, the choices David made throughout his life would take him there in that moment of despair, where the only option was to flee. When he learned that his son Absalom had rebelled against him and taken control of Jerusalem, David felt the earth beneath his feet crumble. He always believed that his reign would be marked by peace, but now everything was about to fall apart. Jerusalem, the city he loved so much, the city where he had ruled with wisdom and courage, was now under threat from a son who felt betrayed and dissatisfied. And David knew that to preserve his family's life and avoid a bloody war within the city walls, the only way out was to abandon Jerusalem. The king knew he had no more time to waste. With pressure mounting and the hearts of the people divided between loyalty to David and Absalom, the decision to leave was quickly made. He did not want to see Jerusalem destroyed by an internal war. His mind was clouded, but his heart, a father's heart, knew that the most important thing was to save what was left of his family. He called together his officers and, with the grief of a man who has seen his own sons rebel against him, ordered a retreat. But before leaving, David did something that no one could have expected. He left his city in God's hands, trusting that the Lord would take care of everything, even in the midst of pain. With deep sorrow in his heart, David and his followers began their escape. The entourage of exiles was made up of loyal friends who had sworn allegiance to the king. The journey through the streets of Jerusalem, now empty and deserted, was marked by sadness, but also by the awareness that this battle was more than a dispute for a throne. It was a fight for the integrity of his soul and the protection of his loved ones. The people of Israel watched in silence as the king left. Some heads down, others watching with expressions of doubt and even regret. David's grief was not just for the loss of Jerusalem, but for the loss of his own son, who was now his greatest enemy. The king, now a fugitive, knew he would no longer have the comfortable life he once had. His position of authority and power had been taken by Absalom, And he, who had already been through so many battles, now faced one of a different nature. It was not a fight against an external enemy, but against one's own blood. David felt the weight of betrayal, of the bitterness of having been rejected by someone he loved, educated and cared for as a father. But the hardest thing of all was the doubt that haunted his mind. Did I do enough? Could it be that my mistake as a parent led me to this point? During his escape, David had to make difficult decisions. He knew his life and that of his family were at stake. Suddenly, he was no longer the king, no longer the victorious leader, but an ordinary man, fleeing with the few who were still at his side. He was moving away from his home, his city, his own land, while Absalom's army advanced in full force to take the throne. But even with this immense pain, David continued to be the man of faith he always was. He knew his mission was bigger than himself, but now he was in a moment of complete vulnerability. There was no more glory or recognition, just the mission to protect what was left and seek guidance from God, who has always been his source of strength. The act of fleeing was not a surrender, but a strategy to save lives. David knew that the battle between him and his son would be devastating. However, Absalom did not fully understand what was at stake. In his quest for the throne and power, he was digging his own grave, as his pride and thirst for control were about to lead him to a fatal fate. Absalom did not know that true leadership did not come from military power or the ability to conquer territories, but from wisdom, justice, and loyalty. And even though he was on the run, David knew that he still possessed something much stronger than Absalom. He had the heart of the people of Israel. The loyalty of his subjects was not bought with lies or empty promises, but earned by a life of integrity. As David walked the roads of exile, he also reflected on the state of his reign. The coming civil war was not just a battle for sovereignty, but a fight for the morals and values he had always tried to protect. The city he had ruled, with so much difficulty and glory, now seemed far away. And the future, which once seemed so promising, was now cloudy, full of uncertainty. David wasn't sure how this would all end, but he knew one thing was clear: the price of betrayal is always high. And Absalom was about to pay for it in ways he never imagined. David's escape was more than a strategic retreat. It was a moment of deep reflection, a moment of realizing that the war he was about to face would not just be a physical battle, but a moral and spiritual fight. He would have to be more than a warrior. He would have to be a father, a leader, and above all, a man of faith. As Absalom's army advanced, David and his followers sought refuge, but the battle was just beginning. He knew that the coming civil war would be one of the most devastating in Israel's history. However, the question echoing in his mind was, could this conflict be avoided? And could the relationship between father and son be restored? Does this story of David, where he sees his own son rebel against him, make you think about the limits of leadership and love? What is the price of loyalty, and what happens when trust between father and son is broken? I would like to know your opinion about this intense conflict. Leave in the comments what you think of this painful situation. The story that led David to this civil war, this family battle that consumed him, began long before Absalom's open rebellion. In fact, the roots of this tragedy were rooted in a terrible event that occurred years before, but no one could predict the devastating impact it would have. It was the death of Amnon, David's first son, that began the spiral of revenge, grief, and division within the royal family. Amnon, who was supposed to be his father's rightful successor, found himself involved in an unspeakable act that would change the course of his life and, at the same time, condemn his father to unspeakable pain. Amnon, being the firstborn, carried with him the responsibility of the throne of Israel. He had privileges and a prominent place in David's court. But like many young people who have power and status, he didn't know how to deal with it correctly. He was impulsive, and this lack of control over his own desires led him to commit a terrible crime against his own sister, Tamar. Tamar, David's daughter by one of his wives, was known for her beauty and virtue. Amnon, consumed by a sick passion, decided to take an action that no one could imagine coming from a king's son. The story of Tamar and Amnon is marked by indescribable pain. Amnon, in his obsession, came up with a plan to trick Tamar, saying he was sick and asking her to come to him to bring him food. When Tamar arrived in Amnon's room, he forced himself and raped her. The pain and shame Tamar felt at that moment was immeasurable. She tried to resist, but the weight of Amnon's strength made her succumb. She, still in tears and suffering, tried to warn him of the seriousness of his act, asking him to repent, but everything was in vain. After the crime, Amnon felt a mixture of regret and disgust, but he did nothing to repair the harm he caused. Tamar, on the other hand, was left desolate and helpless. She, as a daughter of David, knew that this could not be left aside. Her own brother had committed an atrocity against her, and the weight of carrying that shame would be more than she could bear. She tore her clothes and covered herself with ashes, a symbol of her lament and despair. She knew her life would never be the same. David, as a father, was alerted about what had happened, but his reaction was cold, distant. Although he was a man with a sensitive and fair heart, at this moment, he fell silent. David probably felt helpless in such a delicate situation. The pain of seeing your daughter being raped by your own son was devastating, but the lack of action, the omission of justice, was what really marked the tragedy. He took no action against Amnon, which created deep resentment in Absalom, Tamar's brother. Absalom, unlike David, did not remain silent in the face of this injustice. The brotherly love he felt for Tamar consumed him. He, with a growing hatred within him, swore revenge on Amnon. The pain he felt for his sister was transformed into a burning desire for justice. But instead of going to King David to resolve the issue, Absalom decided to take the situation into his own hands. He began to plot his revenge in a silent and calculating way. For 2 years, Absalom kept his anger bottled up while he observed David's indifference to Tamar's suffering. He knew that his father would not take action to punish Amnon, so he decided to act alone. Absalom used his position of privilege to get closer to Amnon, creating a false friendship to hide his intentions. He, with great cunning, invited Amnon to a family banquet. There, he set up an ambush with the help of his servants, and when Amnon was vulnerable, he ordered him to be killed. Amnon was murdered by his own brother in an action that marked the end of his life and the beginning of a cycle of death and revenge that would never be interrupted. Amnon's death did not bring relief, but rather more pain. Absalom fled immediately after committing the crime, fearing for his own life. David, now devastated by the loss of his first son, didn't know what to do. He found himself faced with an irreparable tragedy. Amnon's death and Absalom's escape left him even more isolated, lost, not knowing how to deal with the situation. Their home was divided, and what was a united family began to fragment before everyone's eyes. This tragedy not only deeply affected David as a king, but also as a father. He was not able to act correctly when the moment called for it. His lack of justice regarding Amnon's crime against Tamar set the stage for Absalom's revenge, which led to his brother's death. David now found himself with the weight of guilt on his shoulders. Their children's sin was not only the result of their own actions, but also of the lack of justice within their own home. The king of Israel, who had been chosen by God, now faced the disintegration of his family and chaos spreading throughout the kingdom. This tragedy, the death of Amnon, was just the beginning of a series of events that continued to bring David's family into disarray. Absalom's revenge was not limited to an isolated act, but fueled division and hatred among David's sons. The king could no longer deny that he had lost control of his own household. And the worst of all was that the price of David's lack of action would be charged with the death of other children, which, in the end, would end in a bottomless abyss of suffering and loss. Amnon's death was undoubtedly one of the greatest tragedies of David's life, but what happened next was even more devastating. Absalom's revenge, fueled by pain and resentment, would spread like wildfire, consuming everything around him, including the relationship between father and son. From then on, there was no turning back. The history of David's family was marked by grief, revenge, and loss, and nothing could erase the scar that tragedy left. The battle between David and Absalom was not just a war for a throne. It was not just a fight of soldiers and swords. It was, above all, an emotional war, an internal confrontation between a father who was fighting to save his kingdom, but who at the same time was devastated by having to fight his own son. When the final battle came, David knew there was no turning back. The armies were clashing, war cries were echoing through the forest of Ephraim, and the future of Israel was in the hands of an uncertain fate. But what weighed most heavily on David's shoulders was not the weight of war, but the imminent loss of his son Absalom. He knew that battle was not just about winning or losing on the battlefield, it was being locked inside his heart. David's kingdom was being torn apart by a series of painful decisions, but the most difficult of all was having to face Absalom, the son he loved deeply but who betrayed him. Absalom had rebelled against him, led the army against his own father, and openly challenged his authority. David, upon learning of the impending war, gathered his generals, preparing for battle. Those hours before the final confrontation were full of tension. The king knew that every move could be his last, and he was not ready to lose another son, whether in the fight for power or for life. When organizing the troops, David asked his generals to please not kill Absalom. David's pain as a father was indescribable. He knew deep down that if Absalom died, it would be another irreparable family tragedy. It was as if the destruction of Israel was inevitable, not because of the enemy army, but because of the kingdom's own internal division caused by his son's rebellion. The king knew that the battle was a fight of life and death, but he also knew that he could not allow Absalom's blood to be shed at the hands of his own men. The issue for David was personal. It was about salvation, but also about forgiveness and restoration. However, fate was not on his side. Absalom's troops met David's in the dense forests of Ephraim, a difficult and treacherous terrain that favored military strategy. The sound of swords clashing, the shouts of soldiers and the noise of horses riding across the divided land gave the feeling that the end was near. Every step David took was a heavy step, his heart filled with pain and anxiety, for he knew there was no turning back. The forces were divided, the sons and their followers were on opposite sides, and the clash of loyalties and affections was about to reach its climax. As the battle raged in the open, David stood with the men in a commanding position, watching with a heavy heart. He felt the weight of each life lost, but most of all his thoughts were on Absalom. His son had defied everything he believed in, but he still couldn't stop being his father. David's love for Absalom, which in other times had been unconditional, was still there, fighting against the hatred and anger generated by betrayal. He couldn't understand how the son he had once embraced and taught could now be trying to destroy everything he had built. David knew that at some point he would have to face the cruel reality that the conflict was beyond reconciliation. Absalom himself was determined to destroy his father, and every decision he made seemed to lead further into the abyss. The young prince had allowed himself to be consumed by the desire for power, by the need for revenge, and in his pride he could not see what was really at stake. He did not understand that David's kingdom was not just a symbol of power, but of legacy, history, and hope. For David, losing Absalom, his son, would mean losing everything he considered sacred, his family. In the heat of battle, Absalom's fate was sealed. As he rode, his long, voluminous hair became caught in the branches of a tree, something that under normal circumstances would have been a trivial situation. However, at this moment, this simple distraction became the end of an era. Absalom was trapped, hanging by his head, struggling in vain to free himself. He was vulnerable, and his enemies, realizing his situation, did not hesitate to attack him. Some soldiers who were there found him, and without David's permission, killed him, sticking their sword into Absalom's body. When David learned of Absalom's death, the pain he felt was not just the pain of a father who had lost his son, but the pain of a man who knew that his own guilt and failures had contributed to what was happening. Absalom, even though he made cruel and wrong decisions, was still his son. David felt the weight of the loss, but he also felt the pain of a king who, deep in his heart, knew he had failed in his role as a father, allowing family divisions to grow to the point of destruction. David's reaction to Absalom's death was complete devastation. Upon learning that his son was dead, he did not celebrate the victory, he did not feel relief. Instead, he deeply regretted it. He cried, screamed, cried out to heaven, and wondered, like every parent who loses a child, if there was something he could have done to change fate. "Ah, Absalom, my son, if I could die in your place," and was David's cry, echoing in the immense pain that filled his heart. He didn't care about the throne or victories, he just wanted his son to be alive. This pain of David is incomprehensible to many. How can a parent deal with the death of a child, especially when that child was the cause of the pain he faced? David, the man after God's own heart, was now facing the hardest battle of all. The loss of Absalom, the son he loved but who was his greatest enemy. The king, who had defeated giants and conquered lands, now found himself defeated by his own flesh and blood. Absalom's sad end was the culmination of a series of tragedies that marked David's family. His son's death caused the destruction of David's kingdom, but it also exposed the fragility of every human being. The fight against Absalom, more than a military battle, was a test of David's soul, a test of faith, love, and repentance. When the last scream of the battle died down, David was left with an immense emptiness, knowing that despite being king, he had lost something more important than any throne. He had lost his family. The tragedy of the final confrontation between father and son is one of the most painful in biblical history. David's love for Absalom, the pain of having to deal with his own son's betrayal, and the devastating loss of his life are a reflection of the complexities of life and humanity. What do you think of this internal struggle that David faced? How would you deal with betrayal from someone so close to you? Leave your opinion in the comments. Absalom's death happened in such a surreal way that at the same time, it seemed worthy of a tragic tale, but also had a deep and immense symbolism. The king's son, who had been so full of himself, so proud and unbeatable, now found himself tied down by a simple hair rope, something that he, in all his vanity, would never have imagined would be his undoing. Absalom, with his long locks of which he was so proud, now hanging from an oak tree, was vulnerable, within reach of the enemy and death. A cruel irony for someone who had been the leader of a revolt against his own father, determined to take the kingdom by force. What began as a rebellion filled with hope was now unfolding in the most tragic scenario that could be. At that moment, the image of Absalom hanging by his head, with his locks intertwined in the branches of the tree, seemed to be the personification of all his arrogance, of all the pride that had led him to defy David. He who once had it all, the love of the people, the loyalty of his followers, and the throne within his reach, was now nothing more than a shadow of what he could have been. As king, David had faced giants, conquered lands, and overthrown powerful enemies. But there was no strength in the world that could prepare him for the pain of seeing his own son, the son he loved, betray him in this way. When Joab, one of David's generals, found Absalom in that vulnerable position, he did something David had never asked him to do. Joab, in a merciless act without hesitation, gave the order for Absalom to be killed, directly disobeying the king's will. David had asked his commanders to spare him, even though he was at war with his own son. David's order was clear: "Take care of Absalom for my sake, do not touch him." But Joab's command was stronger than a father's heart. Joab, considering that Absalom's life still posed a threat, and believing that his death would bring a quick solution to the war, decided to act on his own. He, without mercy, killed Absalom. The sword stuck in Absalom's body was the end of a revolution that destroyed a family, a kingdom, and the very essence of paternal love. The news of Absalom's death reached David, and what should have been a celebration of the king's victory over the rebellion became an even deeper tragedy. David did not feel victorious. He did not celebrate his son's death, even though Absalom had been responsible for the war and destruction that ravaged the kingdom. David's reaction was one of overwhelming pain, as if the earth beneath his feet was being dragged away, taking him with it. He was devastated, stunned by what had happened. Instead of pride in victory, David was left with only a cry of pain that echoed through the halls of Jerusalem. "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, I wish I had died in your place." David's phrase was not just a lament, but a reflection of a father's deep love, even though his son had committed terrible acts. The king, in uttering these words, was saying more than his pain at the loss of Absalom. He was expressing how divided his soul felt. The pain of losing a child, regardless of your actions, is something that crosses all barriers of human understanding. Even when the child is the enemy, a father's nature is to want to protect, care, and above all, wish that suffering does not fall on him, but on himself. David knew that Absalom's mistake could not be erased, that the betrayal could not be undone, but he also knew that the pain of losing a son had no limits. What was seen was a man who had been fearless in the face of lions and giants, but who now found himself vulnerable in the face of something even greater, the loss of his own flesh and blood. In his heart, the internal battle had no end. He knew that Absalom in his rebellion had dug his own grave, but still, David wished that that ending had not occurred. He wanted to be the one to pay for his son's mistake, to suffer in Absalom's place. David's reaction makes us understand the deep bond between father and son, a bond that goes beyond anything else. Even in the most difficult circumstances, a father's love is something that cannot be erased. However, Absalom's fate was already sealed, and his death could not be undone. David, however, could not contain his pain. The news of Absalom's death echoed throughout the kingdom, but instead of shouts of victory, there was a heavy silence, as if everyone understood that although the war had come to an end, the emotional toll was unbearable. What should have been a victory for David turned into a personal defeat that no kingdom could erase. David's suffering after Absalom's death was not limited to the immediate moment. He carried this pain throughout the rest of his life. The king knew that regardless of what he had done or failed to do, he had lost a son, and this could not be corrected by any conquest. Victory over the rebellion, however necessary for the good of the kingdom, would never bring back Absalom, would never bring back the future they could have shared. The war against Absalom, more than any other conflict, had left an indelible mark on David, and the weight of this loss was forever engraved on his soul. The tragedy of Absalom's death and David's lament is a reflection of how human beings deal with the greatest conflicts in life. Even the strongest, the bravest, can be broken by the weight of love and pain. And David, the anointed king, the man after God's own heart, was not immune to this. What remains when everything is lost is the unconditional love of a father and the immeasurable longing for a son who, although he made a mistake, was forever part of his life. David's suffering after Absalom's death was not just a lament for his lost son, but a true existential crisis. Not only was the king losing a son who, despite his mistakes, had always been in some way part of his life and his heart, but he was also facing a mirror of his own failures and decisions. As a man marked by experience, David knew that this tragedy was not isolated to his son, but also reflected the sequence of mistakes and wrong choices that he himself had made over the years. The pain came not only from seeing Absalom's death, but from realizing how that tragic end was, in some way, a consequence of the failures and paths he himself had taken as a father, as a king, and as a man. At that moment, the great king of Israel, who had faced so many battles and defeated powerful enemies, seemed a shadow of himself. He who had led the people to so many victories and achievements now found himself defeated by pain and regret. He did not care about the military victory he and his army had won over Absalom's forces. Victory in battle meant nothing to him. At that moment, what he wanted desperately was for his son to be alive. He wanted the opportunity to look at Absalom and tell him that he still loved him, that despite everything, he would always have been his son. The war he had won seemed meaningless in the face of the loss of something much greater. The broken relationship with his own son. David, immersed in his pain, could no longer connect with the world around him. The Bible describes David's reaction so vividly that we can almost feel the intensity of his sadness. He threw himself on the floor, unable to stand up, and refused to eat. His body seemed to have lost all energy and vitality. The pain of the lament was so deep that he no longer wanted to eat, as if food were unable to fill the emptiness in his heart. He was physically absent, and the pain was so great that his servants and those close to him began to fear for his mental health. The king of Israel, who had once been bold and full of life, now seemed a broken man, without direction and without hope. David's reaction was a natural expression of regret, but also a manifestation of the emotional burden he was carrying. The loss of Absalom for him was not an isolated tragedy, but the result of everything he had experienced, the choices he had made, the omissions as a father and as a ruler. Absalom's death not only put an end to the rebellion, but also cruelly exposed the reality of the consequences of his actions. David knew he could not change the past, and regret consumed him. He, who had been chosen by God to be king of Israel, was now wondering how things had gotten to this point. This lament, this pain that he expressed, goes beyond the simple lament for a lost son. It is a reflection of the deepest questions of human life. David's pain is, in fact, the pain of every human being when faced with choices and decisions that, no matter how hard they try, cannot be undone. When someone hurts us, we can fight. Against it, we can try to correct it. But when we are responsible for the pain, when the weight of our actions affects us and affects those we love, the situation is very different. And that's what David felt. He knew that to some extent he himself was to blame for everything that had happened. He, as a father, was unable to protect his son from his own choices, and that was unbearable. The scene of David lying on the ground, without eating, is a powerful image. In our everyday lives, we have all experienced moments of deep pain, moments when it seems that life has no meaning and that there is no way to move forward. David's pain is, in a sense, a universal pain. He who had been anointed by God was not immune to human suffering. He, like every other human being, was consumed by pain and guilt. Sometimes the tragedies we experience are not just about losing something or someone, but also about realizing the mistakes we made along the way. And when we see the consequences of our choices, we often feel completely powerless, unable to change what has already been done. However, David's lament is not just an expression of pain. He is a reflection of the true depth of a father's love for his son. Even though Absalom had been responsible for the revolt, even though he had betrayed his own father and put the entire kingdom at risk, David never stopped loving him. His lament was not just about the loss of the throne or the kingdom, but about the loss of the family bond, about the loss of a relationship that could have been restored, but which, through his own failings, ended up being destroyed. The fact that David lay on the ground and refused to eat also teaches us something about the grieving process. Sometimes the pain is so great that we can no longer function normally. Our soul is marked by loss, and as we try to deal with this pain, the world around us seems to keep spinning, but we are trapped in our own feelings, immersed in the sadness that consumes us. David was a man of great victories, but at that moment, he was a broken man, trying to find some kind of inner peace, trying to understand how and why all this happened. He wished to die in his son's place, something that few could understand or imagine, but which, for a father, is the ultimate pain. Absalom's death was not just the loss of a son. It represented the end of an era, the end of a hope, the end of something that David had dreamed of, but that somehow got lost along the way. And now, in the silence of his grief, he was faced with an immutable truth. Absalom's loss was a reflection of the failures in his life, and that void in David's heart would not be filled by any military victory or kingdom conquest. If you have ever experienced any type of loss or deep regret, you can understand a little of what David felt at that moment. And as we look at his lament, perhaps we can ask ourselves, how would we respond if we were in David's shoes? Would we be able to deal with our failures, the pain of loss, the weight of regret in such an intense way? Absalom's death, in addition to being an indescribable personal pain for David, had a devastating impact on the entire kingdom of Israel. The king's lament was not something that was restricted only to his intimate feelings. This tragedy reverberated throughout his government, affecting not only his own life, but the destiny of the people of Israel as a whole. What seemed to be an end to an internal revolt actually became the mark of an irreversible change in the foundations of his reign. David, who had once been seen as God's anointed, a man after God's own heart, now faced the bitter reality of a reign rocked by family conflicts and infighting. Until that moment, David had been known for his courage and military skill, for his wise leadership, and for his ability to hold together a people with so many tribes and external challenges. However, Absalom's death was not a simple military victory. It was the end of something deeper, the end of the unshakable trust that the people of Israel placed in him. Throughout his life, David had been a leader capable of inspiring his people. His victories were epic, and his ability to unite the Israelites under a single banner of faith and courage seemed unquestionable. But the tragic event involving his son Absalom, a son he had somehow helped turn into an enemy, shook the moral and political fabric of David's reign. David's heart, torn apart by pain, could no longer be the same. He was, in a way, marked not only by personal losses, but also by the scars of his choices as king. Doubts began to arise within his own people. Distrust crept into the minds of the Israelites. The tragedy within David's house was something that could not be ignored, and many began to question his ability to rule, not only because of the way he handled Absalom's rebellion, but because of his lack of control and authority within his own family. How could he rule an entire nation when he couldn't even keep peace within his own home? These questions were not just about David's personal mistakes, but about the loss of moral authority he had suffered. The idea of a king who leads with justice, mercy, and wisdom has been diluted by the family tragedy that unfolded before the eyes of the people. Furthermore, the destruction of the relationship between David and Absalom was something that could not be easily overcome. The loss of a son is devastating, but for David, this event was not just about the death of Absalom. It was the end of a dream. Absalom, before the revolt, had been seen as a hope for the future of the kingdom. He was handsome, charismatic, and for a time he seemed to be David's natural heir. The Israelite people began to see in Absalom a possibility of renewal and stability, especially after the succession of internal struggles in the kingdom of Israel. However, when Absalom turned against his own father and took Jerusalem, his actions destroyed what could have been a promising future for the kingdom. Absalom's death not only destroyed the relationship between father and son, but also shattered the hopes of many Israelites for Israel's future. Many saw David as a declining king whose failures had put the kingdom at risk, and Absalom as the future that never materialized. Furthermore, David's military victory was not enough to restore peace or the people's confidence. He returned to the throne, but with a shadow of doubt hanging over him. His reign, although renewed, was no longer the same. The tribes of Israel, who had previously viewed David as a unifying leader, now viewed him with suspicion. Many of his closest allies began to question his ability to lead and his authority over the people. As the man who had been chosen to be Israel's king, David now faced the weight of his own failure as a father and leader. David's suffering, evidently, was not limited to mourning his son, but expanded to the ramifications of his choices as king. Israel's own political system, which until then had remained cohesive under his leadership, began to fragment. The division that formed between David and Absalom was not just a struggle between father and son, but also a struggle for leadership of the country. And although David won the military battle, he lost something much more significant: the people's trust. He became increasingly aware that his victory came at a high price, and that rebuilding confidence in his reign would be a slow and arduous process. As a result, David found himself immersed in a profound dilemma. Not only had he lost the son he loved, but now he also faced the loss of his place of prestige and respect among his people. As king, he knew that his mission was not only to rule wisely, but also to be a moral example for the people. His failure as a father made this mission even more difficult. How could he lead a people who now looked at him with suspicion? How could he restore order to a kingdom that had found itself divided by the pain and betrayal of its own blood? As the days passed, David felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him. The pain of Absalom's loss, combined with the collapse of his authority, transformed David into a reclusive and introspective man. He withdrew to reflect on his failures and try to understand what had gone wrong, not only in his family, but also in the kingdom. He knew he couldn't reverse what had happened, but perhaps deep down, he still harbored hope that, over time, the people would forgive him and accept him back, despite his mistakes. But the truth was that while the people of Israel looked to the future with uncertainty, David was lost in his own lament, trying to somehow deal with the pain he felt. The throne, although restored, no longer had the same meaning for him. He knew that Israel's reign would never be the same, and the price of his choices is reflected to this day in the way David's story is remembered. The impact of Absalom's death, therefore, was not only personal, but institutional. David's reign would never be the same, and the echo of this tragedy would continue to reverberate throughout the years, both in David's life and in the destiny of Israel. He had lost something fundamental: the trust of the people. and the peace. He sought so much. The pain David felt was not just ordinary pain. It wasn't just the weight of losing a child, but the weight of having failed him. The weight of having been a father who, by not correcting in time, saw a son lose himself in rebellion, and another son rebel against him. David, as king, found himself faced with a dilemma that no title or status could alleviate. He was king of Israel, but in his own home, destruction was in sight. In his home, he no longer had control. He failed to be the father his children needed, and the most painful thing, he knew it. He felt in his chest the anguish of a man who made a mistake, who lost his direction, but who could no longer go back. When Absalom, his son, his own blood, rose up against him, it was not just a political battle. It was a battle of emotions, of a father's heart torn apart. David didn't just see one enemy. He saw the son who, because of his failures as a father, was now lost. He saw not just a threat to his throne, but the pain of a father who failed to raise and care for the children God gave him. And this is devastating. Because no one, not even a king, is prepared to see their children choose paths of destruction, to see that their decisions, their absences, their failures led them to that point. David's pain was not just a matter of loss, but of guilt. He knew that his inability to discipline and guide his children in the right way had led them to this tragedy. Absalom's death, the fighting, the war between father and son, and the suffering of losing control over his own household. All of this was not just a loss of a kingdom, it was the loss of a family, of something that David didn't know if he could restore. And he, the great king, the man after God's own heart, had to deal with this reality. He had failed as a father, and the pain of knowing this consumed him. It wasn't easy for him, and it's important to remember that. It was not a pain that could be alleviated with nice words or a simple prayer. David's pain, the pain of losing a son in a tragic way, of seeing another son rebel against him, was a physical pain, an emotional pain, a spiritual pain. He lost control of everything, and at the same time he found himself powerless over his own choices. He who had been so strong in his victories was now being crushed by guilt and regret, and most distressing of all, when Absalom died, David did not celebrate. He did not celebrate the victory of the Israeli army. There was no victory. For him, there was only pain. There was only the lament of a father who was unable to save his son, who was now dead. The pain was so great that he cried out, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, I wish I had died in your place." Imagine for a moment what he felt in that moment. It wasn't just the death of a child, it was the loss of a father's love for his son, of a broken relationship that would never be restored. But David, even in his deepest pain, teaches us something fundamental. He, like all of us, had his failures, his losses, his moments of weakness, and yet he did not give up seeking God, even though his pain was overwhelming. He lay down on the ground, cried, and refused to eat, but he did not abandon his faith. He was a man who repented and sought strength in God to move forward. Even with the deep scars, David understood that God was still with him, and that despite his faults, God loved him. This is something that perhaps the deepest pain can teach, as that despite our failures, God loves us and can restore what we have lost. And maybe you, who are reading these words now, also have your scars, your flaws, and your pain. Maybe you lost something or someone. Maybe you regretted choices you made in the past. Perhaps you are now living under the weight of the consequences of decisions you made. But know one thing, you are not alone. David, the great king of Israel, also experienced this pain. He also felt the sadness of a broken heart. But in the end, God went with him. And just as he was with David, he can also be with you, ready to help you carry pain, restoration, and forgiveness. I know it's hard, but the most important thing is to remember, no matter how great the pain or how heavy the scars, God has the power to heal and restore what was lost. He can bring life back where there is death, hope where there is despair. Like David, don't let pain keep you from God, but use it as a means to seek His presence more deeply. David's pain, the pain of losing his children, did not distance him from God, but brought him even closer. Now I want to hear from you. What pain do you carry? What have you learned from David's story, and how has it shaped your journey? I know this story touched a lot of people in a profound way, and I know you have something to share too. So, leave in the comments what you feel, what you think, what David's story brought to your life. And if this video touched your heart, don't forget to like and share with someone who also needs to hear this message. May God bless you. May He give you peace, and may the pain you carry not be the end, but the beginning of a journey of healing and restoration. May you find the strength to move forward and continue to write your own story of faith and hope.